Tymofiy. I'm the region director for Eastern Europe for the World Bank, but I have this wonderful privilege that I get to moderate this fantastic panel and ask Tymofiy all the hard questions that he always asks me. So this is, thank you, Tymofiy, for the privilege. As you see here, one of the things we just did, we're just coming from the launch of Ukraine's second rapid damage and needs assessment. This is, it says it's the World Bank's report, but actually, very importantly, the World Bank did this together with the government of Ukraine and in partnership with the European Commission and the United Nations. And this is an important contribution, we hope, that builds actually on work that the KSE started just days after the war, where, as most of you know, KSE actually started this listing of damages that the invasion from Russia's invasion of Ukraine has wrought on this country. It's the work that KSE is doing, and this work is actually based on an international methodology that was created to address exactly these damages and needs that come from either natural disasters or wars. And this is, of course, the work that we are doing together is also going to add new methodologies, new dimensions to this global asset that we have. But we are very fortunate here to have on the panel three very different viewpoints that I hope that we will be able to bring in. So starting from the middle, you have Bjerde. Anna is my boss, but apart from that, Anna is the vice president for the World Bank for Europe and Central Asia. But in a little over 10 days, Anna is going to become the managing director of operations at the World Bank, essentially the number 2 person at the World Bank after the president. So we grab Anna while she's still directly responsible for Ukraine. To Anna's right is a graduate of KSE, Roman Kachur. So Roman has a very important and interesting role at the World Bank. He represents Ukraine at the World Bank. And so he is our alternate executive director, which means that at most times he says very tough things to World Bank staff, but on Ukraine he doesn't, and he's a big supporter. On the World Bank board, right. So the executive director, it's important to understand. So the World Bank has a board of directors. Remember, the World Bank is comprised of shareholders from over 180 countries in the world. So they are represented, the countries are represented by executive directors who are representing the countries. Ukraine is part of a larger constituency headed by the Netherlands, who has the executive director, and Roman is the alternate executive director representing Ukraine. So he's sort of alternates with the executive director. I don't know who this person is to my right, but maybe you do, most of you. But Tymofiy is an old friend, and of course, great to have him hosting this. So we're going to see if we can do a bit of hard talk with Tymofiy and Roman, but Anna, since you're my boss, I'll give you an easy question. So, Anna, you just came from the launch of the Rapid Damage and Needs Assessment, but there is a lot to it and a lot of detail that I hope that many of you will be able to read. But could you share with us your big takeaways from what this found after 1 year of war in Ukraine?
Thank you so much, Arup, and thanks for emphasizing our relationship so eloquently to all the students. But let me say a few things before I take your question. First of all, congratulations for being at the KSE. This is a really reputable, highly regarded school that you're at, and you're studying what we think is, you know, God's calling to man at the World Bank, economics. So, you know, great, really wonderful. And for me also to be able to be here, it's very special because we sit in meetings a lot, of course, with the government, because that's our formal counterpart, but I always love to meet people from other parts of the country that we work with to really get perspective so that the World Bank really fully understands context, different perspectives, different points of views. And this couldn't be more important than it is now as Ukraine is going through this tremendously difficult period. And that's the second thing I want to just say, and you read it and you hear it all the time, but the courage, the bravery, the values that every Ukrainian demonstrates day in and day out is really parallel to none in the world that we have seen. So I will talk about the RDNA, but I just want you to know there are so many people behind you. And in the World Bank group alone, we are many, many people. In my next job, as Arup also talked about, which I will still be your boss, a little bit removed, but still, yeah, just reminding you in case you want to ask me tough questions. But there's a huge group of people behind you in the world. There's a huge group of people behind you at the World Bank. So I just wanted to say that. And we every day wake up to really be behind you and to support you, because what Ukraine is going through is absolutely unacceptable. It shouldn't happen this way anytime, and it shouldn't be happening now. Now, how does the RDNA fit into all of this? So the World Bank has for many, many years conducted these rapid damage and needs assessments, and often we do them when there's been a natural disaster. So for example, a couple of weeks ago, we launched a very rapid version of it for Turkey's earthquakes and also for Syria. And we do these utilizing a number of different methodologies. Often it's satellite images. Often it is coupled with data that gets collected by agencies and different parties in countries we work in. And then we apply a methodology that looks both at damages as well as needs. And they're different because the damage is essentially replacement cost, and the needs, of course, take into account what is it that you're building back. And that's often different than what you put in place the first time. Increasingly, we also apply this methodology on situations of war and conflict. So in September, we released RDNA 1, which was really looking at the first 3 months of war. So it was really up until about June 1 or so, and then it took a couple of months to put the data together, and then we released it. And what it showed was that the damages reached about $97 billion. It's a huge amount. And the needs reached about $349 billion, an even greater amount. And that's not uncommon, that from damages to needs, you go 2 to 3 times. And at that time, we also put some priorities around what could be done the first, let's say, 3 years. Of course, we were all hoping that the war will end, reconstruction is around the corner, and then winter came. And all of us, Ukraine had to start focusing on actually getting through the winter, particularly as the Russians started attacking critical infrastructure like energy, which then became the focus. We're now saying, okay, reconstruction has to wait for urgent repairs. This was a very, very big detour because we wanted to be building back better. Instead, money is being spent on repairing, often repairing what was, because it's quicker. Then we had agreed with the government, let's get a full year of war now that we saw that the war was continuing. So we did February to February. And what's very interesting with this is that the damages, remember 97 billion, are now 135 billion. And the needs, instead of 349 billion, are 411 billion. So now you ask yourself, how come 3 months was, let's say, 349 billion, and 12 months is 411? Well, there's 3 key reasons that we have identified. And I should say these numbers are subject to some change as the occupied territories get liberated and we get more granular data, because we did have to utilize mainly satellite images there. So it could be that the number, I always thought the number would be at least double, or maybe like 500-600 billion. But still, let me tell you what the 3 reasons are. The first reason is actually one of victory for Ukraine. Because what we saw on maps, and this is in the report, the first 3 months, there was quite a lot of territorial gains by the aggressor. And with that, damage in a broader coverage of the geography of Ukraine. What we then saw was pushback by the armed forces of Ukraine, and pushed back to a front line that then more or less stayed. And that front line, territory-wise, is much smaller than the damage that was caused those first 3 months. And there was a lot of damage already caused in that area. So when you're essentially fighting in the same place where there's been so much damage, the incremental damage and therefore the incremental needs are smaller. So one key thing we've been emphasizing during our visit, and I think this is a strong, strong point of strength for Ukraine, is as Ukraine protects its territory, Ukraine has actually also protected the economic consequences of war, because it's better to be at 411 than, let's say, 650 or 700 billion, because it's very still big number, but obviously the smaller it is, the more contained it is, and we can start thinking about shorter term, medium term, longer term. That's number one. Second one is actually the recovery and the repairs never stopped. So both by Ukraine itself and by international community, we always kept investing, because we felt if we wait until the war ends, it's going to be more expensive. So just to give you an example, of course, energy was restored as energy needed to be restored. Critical components were imported, donated, and I saw your generators here when we went on a little tour. This became natural for Ukraine to have backup. So at the same time, that also minimizes, if you will, the aggregate amount for needs, because a lot of work was still undertaken. On the healthcare side, about 500 clinics or so have actually been either fully or partially restored. So this again takes into account that there was work during war. And for us working in the World Bank, this was a main important point, because if you stop helping a country during war and wait until war is over, you have a lot higher cost. You also tend to get erosion in institutions, and you tend to get huge brain drain. So we believe very strongly that you have to help countries through war, through conflict. The third reason will actually resonate with all of you, which is depreciation of the local currency. So if we take 30% of depreciation, on average 25%, the 411 obviously would be much higher, and it is higher if you express it in the local currency. But these are the main three reasons, and I find them very interesting. Now you ask, what are some of the main takeaways? There are sectors that dominate. Transport dominates as damaged, and in terms of needs, housing dominates. And on the energy side, we found a 5-fold increase in the damages caused to energy between RDNA 1 and RDNA 2. Now, what's also great with the RDNA 2, I think, is that we have really zeroed in on 2023, because we want a digestible number that the private sector and the public sector can come around. So we have put the public sector part of it at about 14 billion. And this is what we're discussing with the government while we're here for a few days, because we want the 14 billion to be financed so that at least the damages caused and the needs, in particular high priority areas, up to 14 billion needs to be financed. It includes about 1.5 to 2 billion of support to the private sector, and this could be in the form of guarantees, credits, and so forth, that actually mobilize and leverage and hopefully also catalyzes the private sector, because ultimately the private sector will have to play a key role. I could go on. I might just mention one more thing that we've been discussing with the government, and where I also see a big role for you. No one can do this alone. No international partner, even though I would like to say World Bank can do a lot, we cannot do it alone. We work with so many partners. And likewise, government cannot do this alone. So there's a huge need for everyone to come together, public, private, academia, civil society. And we've been discussing today with the government, and we will continue on tomorrow, and I would actually love to hear your thoughts, things like third-party monitoring, things like analytics and diagnostics that can help lead the conversation in the right direction. We would love to see CSOs engage, for example, in beneficiary feedback. Are services coming? Are they good? What about the issues around governance and corruption? What can we do to get data, to get publications, disclosures? This is something that we all want to work on. So I will finish here, but I think what's very important is in the implementation of RDNA recommendations is that we all work together. And this is where I think it would also be great to have continued support from KSE. I should say, as Arup said, you guys started doing a lot of this work, and it gives a lot of credibility when we have multiple parties come out with analysis. Even if the numbers are not exact, it creates space for debate, for dialogue, and it helps us a lot. So keep up the good work, and really look forward to engaging today. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. I'll come back to you, but maybe I'll go to Tymofiy, to you next. Just pick up on one thing that Anna said, which I know that you're passionate about. So you've been a minister, so you've worked in the public sector.
Yeah, God forbid. Never again.
But right now, you're immersed in the private sector. This is a private university. But the private sector in Ukraine, this has been difficult to get the normal, legitimate, dynamic private sector going across Ukraine. There's points of excellence, but that's not been part of it. It has to be part of Ukraine's future. I know you believe that. So what's going on? How can it be changed? Where do you see the points where these needs are not just met by the state, but also through private endeavor?
All right, so I'm gonna answer that, but I also gonna, plug in things I have to. As they teach in all classes, right?
Absolutely.
So first of all, thank you very much to the World Bank for supporting and implementing and helping and enabling the landmark, pun intended, land market reform when I was the minister. So without the World Bank, that wouldn't be possible. Without all the groundwork that the World Bank has put in before I became the minister, that wouldn't have happened. The way things work is that there are windows of opportunity, political windows of opportunity. We might or might not like that, but that's reality. We might design those windows, but there are windows, and usually there are no windows. And that window of opportunity is really, really short. And so when I became a minister, the law, not perfect, but the law was submitted to the cabinet within 2 weeks on September 15th, when I came in the office on August 29th, to the cabinet to consider and send it to the parliament. Had we delayed that, probably wouldn't be a land market reform today. Now, land market reform is important because after the war, that will be collateral for investment. That will be a source of capital for people working on land to attract it. And it's pretty much not debatable collateral, There is a value of it, and it's a very clear production. So that's one example of us bringing the private sector into the play. So we need to work more on doing reforms, even during the war, which allow us to provide specific financing vehicles to the private sector. But I want to put in a second proposition. This school actually has been founded with the help of the World Bank. And I'm reading an email from Anders Aslund, which I have been ferociously searching for in the beginning of our discussion here, because I was not informed that I will be on the panel. So Arup just put me on the panel right now. That's called ambush. And so I was preparing immediately. And so Aslund writes how the school was created. He said there were 5 people, including him, who did it. 1994, 1995, the real initiator was late William Bader, who was then the president of the Eurasia Foundation. He engaged his friend Boris Pleskovich, who was a director of the Economic Research Department of the World Bank. And the rest is history. 2 of them then went and created a coalition of funders, got the funding, and the World Bank has financed, through, I think, Global Development Network, most of the economic research, most economic research, which was done throughout post-Soviet Union countries in the first 2 decades. If there is a paper and if there is an economist coming out from one of these countries and who is currently either Western trained or Western published or policymaker that has been at some point financed by the World Bank funding through the Kyiv School of Economics. Of course, things has changed in 2014. We rolled back this program. and we're not financing, let's say, Russian economists at all, or even Kazakh economists. But that was the times. And many of the economists you see right now in top universities, they started like that. So I'm grateful to you, to your institution, for financing the science of and education of economics in Ukraine. And we talked about other things we can do going forward, about how we can help with recovery. On the private sector, I think my personal view is that the issue is not funding. The issue is projects. I recently had a conversation with a very well-informed and a very competent person who was talking about some manufacturing and some development project in green energy. And I asked him how much funding would it need. He said, you know, $1 billion plus maybe $2 billion. The project is good, it's really good. I can see how a fund like BlackRock would finance a project like that in Brazil. And so I asked him, who is on your team? Who is a CEO or a founder who can get in a room and have a conversation over $1 billion projects? And the problem is that we don't have those. We have people who can run a conversation on $100 million. We have people, let's say in Metinvest, who have been able to deploy $1 billion just before the war in improving manufacturing in Azovstal or Illicha. But we really don't have a cohort of top managers who can credibly discuss projects of the value beyond several $100 million. We have not yet have them, and we have to have them. It is similar as with KSE. We need to take time to grow, that we can provide this kind of analysis together with you on par, rather than be an analyst, a junior analyst on a project by the World Bank, and it takes decades to cultivate that. So my view today is that the bottleneck is the capacity to construct, design, engineer, and deploy and implement projects. We are facing that capacity constraint at the Kyiv School of Economics. The funding is important for us, but the real concern was what we discussed in the meeting just before you arrived, and that's why I was a minute late to meet you. We have 46 open vacancies at the Kyiv School of Economics. 46. Yeah, we have closed up about 20, and everyone was excited about it. But we need people. So I think reconstruction of Ukraine and the private sector of Ukraine, it's the people's problem. It's not the funding problem, and it's not the project problem, and it's not even the regulation problem. It's the people's problem. So we have to train people today so they can sustain value-added economy during the war and recover and build a prosperous liberal democracy after the war. Thank you.
Thank you, Tymofiy. I'll come back to you on some of these points, but very, very important to talk about this. Eventually, one of the things that World Bank research also has found is that one of the challenges Ukraine faces in terms of its wealth is that the share of human capital in Ukraine's wealth is actually going down, right? Wealth, in a national wealth, is human capital, physical capital, entrepreneurial capital. The share is going down over time. And that is one of the biggest challenges, I think, for Ukraine's future. Roman, I want to turn to you and really talk about you. Firstly, you are also a graduate of this institution, right? So in a way, you formed some of your initial economic ideas here. But I want to just take you in a different direction, which is talking a bit about these needs. Where do you see the world right now in terms of helping Ukraine meet these needs? Is the world together in meeting the needs? Do you see divisions? Do you see opportunities? And do you see challenges?
Thank you, Arup. First of all, great pleasure to be here. I feel like back home in this institution. second, like the World Bank board, we have to provide oversight to the management and to complement in case they missed anything. So first, the introduction of Tymofiy. It's a great pleasure to see what he has done for this institution and for all of us to be here. And basically having the incoming managing director at this institution while there are other universities in Kyiv, it's also a great sign of recognition for this place. So I think many of you are lucky to be here, and especially in this beautiful facility to study. It wasn't so nice when I was back in ERC in 1998, 2000. Second, I want just to introduce you our incoming country director for Ukraine, Jordan Schwartz. He is humbly sitting on the side. This is the World Bank Ukraine guy. He will start in a couple of weeks, and based on our tour today, I wouldn't be surprised if you will see a World Bank logo meeting room someday soon in this building. Now, coming back to your question about support for Ukraine, I just want you to pay attention to Anna's right hand and the wrist she has in there. And that's number 2 person in the World Bank showing this sign of support for Ukraine. So we enjoyed and we were honored to have this support from the majority of the World Bank senior management from the day 1 of the war. The first loan to Ukraine by the World Bank to support the macroeconomy was issued on the March 9th. 350 million, 700, right, was mobilized with the partners, were issued on March 9 when the tanks were around Kyiv, approaching especially probably from this direction, passing nearby. We all saw this video. Most our partners just get frozen for a while. No one was sure if we should lend to a country which may fall in a matter of days, and who will be liable to repay those loans, and which government basically is signing those loans on behalf of the country. But the World Bank did, and then other partners followed. And just to mention, last year, half of all foreign aid, almost half of all foreign aid, both loans and grants, were channeled through the World Bank. This is really remarkable that out of 31.4 billion that Ukraine received, 15 plus went through the World Bank accounts, trust funds, own lending, partners mobilization. That basically allowed the Ukrainian economy to stay afloat. But the economy showed incredible resilience, and for many reasons. I won't stop just now on that, but that preserved a lot of human capital, what Arup mentioned, that preserved the economy, that preserved businesses and people of the country. Also, at the World Bank board, as alternate executive director, I represent not only Ukraine, but 13 other countries, and jointly as a board, we represent 189 countries of the world. So in 2 floors of the World Bank, each day you can meet probably a person from every country in the world and see what the feeling is. And most of the people who made it to Washington, they have some connections to their government, so they really know what's going on in their countries. And indeed, the support to Ukraine was unwavering from the day 1. Specifically from I wouldn't say from all countries, and we all know it, but G7, EU countries, now switching to some of Latin American countries, we had the support. So with all operations that the management of the bank brought to the board of directors, all of them were approved, some of them with a remarkable speed the World Bank never saw before. And Ukraine by now set a lot of records at the World Bank. So the main project to finance Ukrainian needs is called peace. World Bank is very famous for finding the acronyms. And no one, I'm not sure that most of the people can know what does the peace stands for, but everyone, you know, Anna will.
If Arup always test me on this. Hold on. Public expenditure administrative capacity enhancement.
So Anna, well, Anna proves that she is fully qualified to become a managing director of the World Bank. Most of the people don't, but they do know what the peace is. President of Ukraine, Prime Minister, most of the government, and many people around the world, they just know the acronym peace. So the peace became the World Bank largest project in its history since the inception in 1944. None of the countries had ever had a larger project than this one. In August last year, the World Bank did in a single disbursement $3 billion for Ukraine. So you can imagine Arup signing the bank wire with a $3 billion amount. When I came to the World Bank in 2016, the annual disbursement to Ukraine was $138 million. So that shows kind of magnitude what the World Bank did and what the partners did. It's not only the World Bank money, it's primarily US money, EU money, and some other partners for Ukraine. This is in the time of war, when Ukraine was in a especially challenging situation. World Bank really became a major partner to support and will be, I hope, supporting Ukraine. For this year, we continue on with the peace project. It's still disbursing enormous amount. Probably all the public sector, civil servants, doctors, teachers, diplomats, all except military salaries in Ukraine are paid with the money transferred from the World Bank. All resources Ukraine mobilized domestically, taxes, custom duties, local borrowing, are used for military expenditures. Mostly everything else is financed by the bank and few other partners. But also want to make a brief reference before the war, and Tymofiy alluded to this about the land market reforms. That was a remarkable reform. Anna especially succeeded in promoting this reform. It was in the agenda for 30 years. I think it's probably the largest untapped Ukrainian wealth that Ukraine after the war will be able to leverage with private financing and technologies to increase the total productivity. But also World Bank contributed to many other reforms. Just yesterday we went to Hostomel. It's a small healthcare facility in Hostomel. Incredibly resilient people, and we talked to them. Bank did some minor contributions to buy some equipment for this facility, but that was not the most one. The most why this facility exists, because the World Bank helped to do Ukraine a healthcare reform. Very complex, one of the most complex in the world sectors that you do the reform, and you witness a success of this reform. You witness people who are there, full of energy, with good prospects and for further development, and strong vision how they can develop. So that turned around the whole sector, and that's the World Bank business globally, to turn the sectors around and to do the reforms which benefits the people, reduce poverty, and creates a shared prosperity. And now the World Bank tries to do it in a more sustainable way. So, Arup, I don't want to hijack all the time. I'll be happy that if we have some time for the interaction.
Indeed. So, I'll come back to the panel, but I really want to make sure that we hear from all of you. So, questions, comments, clarifications, ideas. What would you like, my challenge to all of you here as future leaders of Ukraine and future leaders of the world, what do you want to hear from this panel, and where do you want to direct us? So let me walk around. I'll go like this to the first three questions. Why don't you identify yourself, address it to a particular person if you would like. I'll take all three questions and then come back to that.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Kyiv School. I'm Executive Director at the Center for Economic Strategy. We are partners of Kyiv School of Economics in damage assessment project. Like Yuri is my colleague who is working on education and healthcare damages assessment here. But I want to ask about like different things, but related to, in fact, reconstruction. It looks like Ukraine lost the previous summer as a period when reconstruction could be done, as everybody were expecting for the fast pace, for large multi-hundred billion dollar financing for large beautiful cities like in Le Corbusier like drawings. But we lost this period. And like in the occupied areas of Ukraine, like not so much was done. We discussed it with Roman and Lugana, in fact. The challenges that were in this process that time. Now, like, do you expect that something will be different this year? Or will we lost another summer? Thank you.
Thank you. Let me go here.
Thank you, and thank you for coming. I'm Tom. I'm a guest. I'm not Ukrainian, by the way. I'm British, but I'm a guest lecturer at KSE. I think a lot about Ukrainian debt burden. Ukraine is going to be, already was extremely indebted before the full-scale invasion. And actually, for reasons that I don't fully understand, the World Bank didn't classify Ukraine as an in-conflict country until maybe July 2022. I'm not entirely sure what the logic behind that was, but now going forward, I wonder, what is the plan in terms of reducing Ukraine's debt burden after the war? Is this something you can already start talking about, or is it clever to keep your cards close to your chest and then after the conflict decide what you do with this enormous debt burden?
Thank you. I don't know whether Anna's prepared to do a public announcement yet, but we'll let you do that. Please.
Thank you very much for visiting our country. It's a pleasure to be here. And my name is Yulia. I'm a student of the Institution of International Relations. And my question is, how can you access the investment environment before the war and now? And what are the steps that need to be taken by the government of Ukraine, by citizens and by businessmen to encourage private businessmen from abroad to invest in our country, in reconstruction and in rebuilding our cities and our country? Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. Let's take these three questions and we'll come back again. So I was teasing Tymofiy is that this last question was the one that I asked him, which he didn't fully answer. So I will see if he can answer it this time. But who will go first? Roman, let's go like this. Do you want to pick up any of these questions?
I can pick up the question since I go first. Let me pick up on the private sector environment. First of all, Ukraine has a very tough legacy on the private sector. You know, the real reforms in many sectors hasn't been done for decades since Ukraine independence. Many sectors are captured by oligarchs and actually didn't allow for any competition. Ukraine did a lot of progress since 2014. Back then, the World Bank was issuing a doing business report, and Ukraine moved from the 100+ rank to 64 on the last report that was issued by the World Bank, which acknowledges the progress that Ukraine did. And that, to a large extent, is also an explanation why the country is such a resilient during the war, the businesses and the government, because of the reforms that were done by Tymofiy when he was in the government, many other people. But this is unfinished agenda. Obviously, 64th rank where the report stopped, and we all know the other reforms have unfinished agenda. The rule of law, the continued anti-corruption, promoting the business environment, competitive markets, that's still a lot to be done. Right now, we all acknowledge that the prime focus last year was just to keep the state running, to pay salaries, to pay pensions. Not much attention was paid to developing the business environment. Frankly, I'm not sure much could be done. Not much was done on sustainability, and we just discussed, obviously you care less about sustainability if you care about safety first. But this is the areas where the World Bank will be supporting Ukraine. The Rapid and Damaged Needs Assessment Report and the fact that this year we are raising financing not only to keep the state running, but to support the private sector. What Anna mentioned, to create some enablers to de-risk the private investments to come to Ukraine, because obviously it's not fully market conditions. We cannot compete with Poland to attract FDI. We cannot compete virtually with most of the countries. But having some instruments, we can attract the private sector investments, like war insurance, which we are working on with one of the World Bank member institutions, Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, MIGA. The IFC, International Finance Corporation, is lending to Ukraine even in a time of war, and they completed a few transactions last year. They will do more this year. It's a very complex transaction. Sometimes they need concessional financing from donors, but because even the large institutions, they have their own risk management framework, so they need some donor money to offset their own risks. But we are able to create these instruments for the private sector, and we are able to leverage a private sector money much more than the bilateral states can provide. Each country, especially after COVID, is quite limited in providing own financing. I take your signs, Arup, that I'll pass the mic to
I
Anna.
want more questions answered. So,
Okay.
Anna, do you want to come in, and then Timothy, please?
Maybe just a few reactions. So do we waste another summer? I think, you know, when the war started, we were all hoping it would end soon. And there was a lot of talk about reconstruction starting after the war. I think as the war continued, and many people talk about a war of attrition, a frozen conflict, I think the recognition pretty quickly moved to the fact that it's not a sequential thing, where, you know, you first do a bit of relief, what we called it, which is, you know, the funding of the budget, the social protection and so forth. Then you do recovery, which might be a couple of years, and then you're in a long-term reconstruction mode. I think now we feel you have to be more opportunistic, and you have to actually be more risk-taking. That means at the World Bank, we take projects to the board of infrastructure, for example, repairs now of the transport system and the energy system, where we have to accept that there might be incidents whereby the asset is actually affected. And we have to be okay with that. We try to minimize it by being smart, like this mobile equipment that's available now, for example, for bridges. But I think we have come to realize, the whole community, that you cannot wait. And that's actually a bit of a novelty in how we do post-conflict, post-disaster reconstruction. So my sense is that it's not gonna be a wait and see or waste, but it does mean that there might be some geographies in Ukraine that got more attention than others. There might be some technological solutions that are more temporary in nature than what you really want ultimately down the road. And I think that's okay. But not doing it hurts human capital, and it hurts the revival of the economy, and it's going to cost more later on. So we have to do it. On the issue of debt and classification as a fragile country, we do these annual, which is why it didn't come until June, and we'll do it again now in June, and Ukraine will remain on the list. And that does give it access to certain new terms, if you will. In terms of the indebtedness, we have been arguing so hard that the best way to help Ukraine is through grants. And here I have to say, hats off to the United States, who have been channeling huge amounts of grants to Ukraine. And I think actually this administration has been incredibly forward-leaning, and they're moving the money through this platform called Peace that Roman talked about. I mean, these are massive amounts of money. Of course, humanitarian, military, and then the economic aid is going through the World Bank. The other thing is the EU MFA that was recently approved is moving the interest rates down almost to what we offer to the lowest income countries in the world. This is something we've also been talking about. How do you buy down interest rates so that if it is $1 billion loan, it doesn't get your usual interest rate, it gets a bought down interest rate through some grant funds. So that's something we would like to try out now. And then thirdly, the reality is Ukraine needs volume right now, volume of money. So we start with getting all the grants we can, then we get the lowest cost money that can come to Ukraine, and then we accept a certain amount of interest-bearing obligations, because at the end of the day, the money has to come. With an IMF program coming on board, there will have to be a management plan for debt. We know it. It was always the case with IMF. I think we'll have to see how it goes. Sometimes it's at the beginning of an IMF program, sometimes it's the first review, sometimes it's before the program ends, which in this case is 4 years. So I think there's enough time to think through the debt management strategy for the country. In all likelihood, there will need to be a very clear approach to managing the level of debt, because it has gone up and the economy has gone down. So debt to GDP is actually now at quite alarming levels. So this will have to be dealt with. We are not right now at a point where we can say A, B, C will be done, but my message remains: grants first, really low interest rates second, and if you really still need the volume, take the volume with as best terms you can get. And if you have to pay for the interest rate, try to put that type of borrowing towards revenue earning projects like investment projects, not necessarily recurrent expenditure. So that's also what we're trying to see. What money do you use for what? And I think that's actually a helpful discussion to have. Now, I forgot the question over here.
So private sector, but let Tymofiy take that if you...
Yes, Tymofiy takes that.
So in the private sector, which version of the question do we want to answer? What does it take to get private sector in?
Get real private sector, good private sector, high productivity private sector.
Developed internally or bring from abroad? That's one question,
yeah.
Okay?
So both. Right?
And if we talk about develop internally, then the question is how we keep people right now. Because what is going to happen, the EU will open up post-war and already for people who are talented. On the other side of the equation, there is a question of corruption and judiciary. So there is, of course, perception of corruption, and there is real corruption. They're different, and many people are confused about that and don't separate them. Ukraine has two brands. One is a successful democracy, a beacon and example for all other post-Soviet countries, what they should be striving, if they are lucky, to achieve. We have been solving our problems. We have received the same legacy of the Soviet Union as every other country in the region. And nonetheless, we have had a number of revolutions, and every way we somehow wavered, we corrected the course. So it's the society which behaves differently here, and it's an example for other societies. I'm not so sure about Russia at this moment. I'm skeptical. I think they've got a real culture problem, and maybe an alternative universe or timeline, but not in this one. So, but that's not the topic of discussion here. But there are, and Belarus too, but there are other countries like Stans, Asian countries, which could look at what Ukraine has done in terms of democracy. So that's the good brand. And then there is the bad brand, which is a part of the legacy, which we have been fighting, and also a part of the Russian propaganda. Vladimir Putin actually used corruption in Ukraine in his speech on February 21st, 2022 to justify his invasion to come in 3 days, saying that our politicians are on payroll of vested interests and therefore we are not legitimate. This is not true. Our government, our president, our prime minister, they are legitimate, and the degree of the corruption is probably 1/100 of what it was during the Yanukovych time. Nonetheless, we have to continue to address the issue. And that's a different discussion for a long discussion, but it's an important discussion. So I think the answer for businesses, if I'm a businessman, I'm a Ukrainian potentially, talented person, entrepreneur, I'm thinking, should I stay in Ukraine or should I go to Europe? And I'm actually trading out these two things. I'm thinking, okay, there are all these opportunities, that's the good part. But there are all these issues, that's the bad part. Okay, and so we have to be working on the good part and on minimizing the bad part, which is governance, corruption, institutions, rule of law, judicial reform, regulation, customs reform, and I can name another 5, 10. And this is an engineering problem in many ways. You can split them up, but it's also a political problem. Then if we talk about the foreign investment, it's the same story. Should I come to Ukraine? Many people right now are willing to come, and I've had conversations with people who are billionaires on the Wall Street recently, and they said, oh, I'm willing to invest $5, $10, $50 million. It's actually not going to be, for me, the primary investment. I'm not going to look forward to getting a huge return. I just want not to be abused and get taken advantage of. And at the same time, I want my investment to be meaningful. So again, we hit these two things. The good thing, people are attracted by something that they feel that they can have a meaningful investment, but they're concerned about being abused by the system, by the bad part of the brand. So it's not an economic answer, it's more of a political marketing answer. But we really have to address that, because if we don't, we won't be able to attract talent and attract investments. And to address that, of course, in the end, this marketing political answer, branding answer, comes down to specific reforms and specific rules of the game and institutions. So that would be my answer. Work on making sure that perception of corruption gets to where it is, because we, I think, unjustly criticized and perceived, as the most corrupt country in Europe. Well, go to Hungary, I'm serious. Go to Hungary, open a business in Budapest, and you'll have to give a share to the government to be able to operate. That's unimaginable in Ukraine. Nothing what happens there is possible here. And I can name other countries. I can talk about developed countries which have been corrupted on the national security kind of level, at least some politicians, because they have taken an easier road. Ukraine has never taken an easier road, but Ukraine has its legacy problems. So we have to address them. But we also have to address the substance. We need to get judicial done. And to wrap it up, and I need to do thanks, but I will do them in, somewhere in the end, and acknowledgements, and thank the World Bank and KSE again. But and I'm talking to the audience who are expecting that, so I'm just saying I'm going to do it later. Yeah. But the reform, the judicial, is not going to happen by itself. It's not going to happen because the IMF will write it down. Just on my memory, and I have only been here since 2014, I know of at least 5 attempts at the judicial reform. And what we know from the judicial reforms elsewhere, that it is businessmen who have had enough of being exploited, that finally have overcome the collective action problem and created a sufficient demand to the government, to politicians, to actually clean up the act. And so I think until that happens, we will have a difficult road. And therefore my recommendation is for businesses who want to operate today and in the future in Ukraine, please get together, deploy resources, lobby for judicial reform, and move it forward. It has been done in other countries, it has been done to an extent here, and it will be done here.
Thank you. Thank you, all three of you. I'm going to take one last round of questions, and then we'll pause. Now, too many hands. I'm going to, unfortunately, pick and choose. So I'll go to you first. You had your hand up early, and I will go to you.
Thank you very much, Arup. Thank you. My name is Alessia Hrysko. As a former UN employee, I'm very delighted that the RDNA has been partially also in cooperation with the United Nations, but I here represent the RISE UA coalition, which is a coalition of more than 40, almost 50 already Ukrainian and international civic organizations that are united around the principles of transparency, accountability, and a sustainable recovery of Ukraine. And what we are currently implementing is a digital recovery management system that we will be handing over to the government, basically an example of how we work together, civil society and the government, since at least 2014. I have a comment and a very small, quick question. A comment is, we have been discussing here different successful reforms, starting from land reform and healthcare reform, and I would like to put in another one, which is the decentralization reform. And as a representative of civil society, I think it's really paramount that our international partners and the civil society unite in advocating for the results of the decentralization reform not to be abandoned post-war, because I think everyone agrees here is that the local communities, the local gromadas will be the backbone of the recovery of Ukraine. And one quick question, which is basically a little bit a continuation of what Mr. Mylovanov just mentioned. Our coalition is also very active in advocacy, and we understand in the future, especially post-war, there will be a very huge Ukraine fatigue, and the argument will be, we have flooded you with a lot of humanitarian aid, military aid, macro-financial assistance, why should we keep on financing Ukraine? And I would like to ask, if possible, all of our panelists, including you, Arup, to maybe present one key argument for you, or the pitch that you would bring to both private sector and to individual countries. Why still helping Ukraine?
Thank you. That's a good thing to keep on challenging. So let me.
Thank you very much. My name is Alex Ryabchin. I have a different role, but more like 20 years in green business, green politics, and green policy making. Also, I'm a climate diplomat from Ukraine, representing my country at 7th COP, started from Paris and Sharm el-Sheikh, hope to be in Dubai too. And the question is basically, we are speaking about the rapid recovery, fast recovery, or whatever, like unconditional recovery. Basically, it's recovery for like give the money and survive the winter, survive the war. But we do understand that somewhere, you know, off the radar, like especially I do believe in the World Bank, there are talks about the green Build Back Better recovery condition. It's not yet public. You cannot demand from Ukraine some, you know, CO2 reduction right now during the war. But like, could you please disclose something, you know, what will be the condition for green recovery? What is a green recovery for you? Whether it's just green per se investment in a renewable, or it will be due to taxonomy, ESG, SDGs, whatever. I'm asking because here I'm in as a researcher with the Kyiv School of Economics, with Tymofiy and Natalia doing this project on a green recovery for the government of Ukraine. So like, ready to hear your thoughts about this. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll take the last question.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here today. My name is Volodymyr, and I'm a student of International Economic Relations. I want to address my question to Mr. Tymofiy. A year ago, you wrote a big program article named A Blueprint of Reconstruction of Ukraine with 7 leading economists of the world. And you wrote in that article that about institutional design for funneling aid into Ukraine. You wrote that today Ukraine calls for establishing a dedicated agency, for example, which was Economic Cooperation Administration, which administrated the Marshall Plan in Europe after World War II. And my question is, in which way you think this agency can be established, and maybe it can be represented also by the World Bank? Thank you.
Okay, so that's the area in which maybe you will censor me.
Go ahead.
Can I?
Yes.
But there are other questions.
We'll go in this way. No,
oh, no.
This is, we'll just have
if
a
you
last
want,
round of answers.
Okay, I'm going to be fast on this, and that's it. It is true that as an economist, within my thinking, I advocate for an establishment of a separate agency. 2 reasons. There are many more, but 2 reasons. One, it would force a specific renewed commitment for when it should be started. So if it were to be created, that's a big if, but if it were to be created, then countries which participate in that at the creation would have to make commitments. And they would have to be formalized. And that would address a lot of issues on debt sustainability and other things. People would have to deploy funds. There would be quotas. The second one, it also would have a sunset clause when it shuts down. When does it shut down? When Ukraine joins the EU. It would be a very clear structural agency. The problem is exactly this fatigue, that everyone is making these commitments on the spot, but as things gonna normalize here, the desire, political desire to make further commitments, which will be needed, will vanish. And that was the concern and the design suggestion, that you want to have to get commitments right now. Everyone says it's going to take, we're going to be with Ukraine as long as it takes. By the way, they should be saying we will give Ukraine what it takes to win, rather we're going to stay with Ukraine as long as it takes. Because the longer it takes, the more difficult it becomes. And people pay in lives for this. So that pisses me off, that kind of perspective. But anyway, obviously I'm in the midst of it. I'm traumatized. I have a right to say this. And this is simply not right to yes, we're gonna wait and take as long as. But I also don't believe that everyone will stay with Ukraine when things will become well in Ukraine. So in that sense, I wanted to collect these commitments now, and I wanted to force people to commit through a formal mechanism, some kind of agency that we put. But the idea was not the agency per se, but a commitment mechanism. But also commit that it's not gonna be never-ending agency. That it will be a project agency, that, we joined the EU and we are done. But in practice, that's not how the world works. In practice, the world works, whoever runs faster will be the agency. So far, the World Bank is running faster than others. Okay? So there are some issues which I always raise and everyone tells me to shut up, and I'm gonna be very delicate this time. The problem is that for Ukrainians, the World Bank still has a shareholder, Russia. And for Ukraine, it will be very difficult to accept that in some way or another, normally, nominally, or not de facto at all, even if they are not present, there is still some say of a shareholder of Russia over how Ukraine should be rebuilt. That's gonna generate some resentment over time. That's gonna be a political issue. It's a mine which is inbuilt in this mechanism. So the Russian participation in this has to be suspended, or even better in our view, Ukrainian position is that they have to be removed from these international institutions because they have violated the international law. And until they start respecting the international law, they should not be at the table, okay? But that's not what the reality is, and we'll continue to advocate it. That's not the discussion today, but that's my answer to the agency, okay? There are some structural problems, and we're not addressing them right now.
Roman, I'll turn to you and then end with Anna and perhaps end with some comments from me.
First, to Olesa, pleased to see you here. I believe that world and what I face every day at work, so people are extremely pragmatic. And that probably would be the main reason to support Ukraine. Only after many supply chains collapsed in food security, in energy supplies to Europe, and Ukraine has been exporting energy to Europe, now also military security. So Europe and the world, the rest of the world, needs Ukraine. So there is a very pragmatic reason. Obviously, there are some obligations which Tymofiy said. I don't believe in any long-term commitments as the circumstances change and the dynamics change. Each country has its own political cycles and many other reasons, but there is a clear economic argument and value of Ukraine in the global supply chain, in a global economy. And that's what I believe in. I believe in a private sector, in the role of private sector. That will be big because the numbers we presented today for 110 billion, that's unthinkable for most of the businesses, so for most of the our donors and partners. We already receive only half in grants and half in loans. And this is stretched. Countries are stretched after COVID, after other crises that are facing. So I do believe that there will be a big role for private sector and just pure rationale behind their participation investing in Ukraine. A quick response to Alex, I think very valid question. Actually, if you look on the overall the World Bank, it's going through the reform itself. It is called the evolution process. When the World Bank revisits its mission, vision to add sustainability, that also turned into the governance reform. So you probably heard that the World Bank will have a new president starting from who will start July 1st. Most likely a person oriented and very much committed to the environment and development of the private sector, and then goes down through to all business processes, to corporate scorecards, to type of investments and lending that the World Bank does. And we will closely work on Ukraine. The World Bank developed a new type of reports for each country. It's called Climate Change Development Reports, CCDRs, which basically looks at the country perspective of development through the climate lens. How can we develop country in the sustainable green way? So this is now basically the baseline approach to World Bank business in most of the countries.
Thank you. A couple of additional reflections. Why continue to support Ukraine? 3 reasons, I think. The first one is clearly Ukraine has to win this war, not just for Ukraine, but also for the rest of the world, because it is unacceptable to try to conquer someone else's territory in this brutal manner or in any manner, and I don't think we can accept the outcome of any other scenario. And as a development institution, we don't really talk about this very directly, openly, but I think there is a recognition that every country has a right to their territorial integrity, and the consequences of putting that at risk with brutality has huge developmental setbacks, which is the second reason, which is, and we have done numbers on this, the setbacks to Ukraine's progress from this war is quite high. We talk right now mainly about damages and needs in very sort of concrete terms and quite practically, but if you look at the gains Ukraine has made on poverty reduction over the last 20 years, it's enormous, and the reversal to poverty reduction and the increase in poverty is equally very daunting. So we put Ukraine's poverty at sort of middle-income country poverty line at about 5% before the war, and now we're estimating at the end of 22 probably around 25%. A quarter of the population now classified as poor. This is a huge reversal, and as a development institution, this for us is why we feel we need to be in there. We need to arrest further deterioration in human capital, in vulnerability, and we need to make sure that everything is protected as much as it can from a development and a humanitarian point of view. And the third reason, frankly, is that Ukraine offers so much to the rest of the world. Roman talked about the implications, and I talked about it this afternoon when we launched the RDNA. This war has huge regional and global consequences. Not having Ukraine be in the food export business has caused a lot of problems around the world. Ukraine can be a massive player for Europe when it comes to a new energy strategy for Europe. And I think what we want to see is exactly that. So the third reason, I think, is that Ukraine is an incredible opportunity, and we need to make sure that Ukraine comes out of this strong and that investments can happen. And actually reconstruction in and of itself will be very positive for growth in Ukraine. It will create jobs and it will create opportunities for investments. So those are the 3 reasons that I see very strongly. Now, what about this whole Build Back Better, sustainability, climate, and so forth? I think there are some low-hanging fruits and there's some more complex, higher cost. So the low-hanging fruits is clearly don't build back what you necessarily had. So when it comes to housing, for example, we will look very closely and carefully at better insulation for energy efficiency. When we look at roads, we will look at, make it a bit broader, make sure that there is some flood mitigation infrastructure put in place. When you look at, public buildings, make sure that everything is equipped from the get-go with disability access and so forth. So there's a lot you can do. The more difficult question will be the energy transition that we actually had started working a lot with the government on, and we were going to do this country climate and development report, and we will still do it. But Ukraine does need to make an energy transition, just like the rest of the world, and really start weaning off coal and fossil fuels towards much more greener options. And what we see now as an institution, and we have to finance the least cost option, right? That's what our motto is. And the least cost option increasingly is wind and solar. So there's this whole technology change that's happening. But that will be a bigger conversation. I think initially we have to really look at these relatively easy, straightforward retrofits that makes building back better much more sustainable. And I think that's really the way to go. On creation of agency and institutional aspects, I think the question has been answered well. I do feel, and we've talked about it while we've been here, that institutional capacity to be able to deal with reconstruction has to be built. Just on the public sector, before the war, Ukraine's absorption capacity for capital investment projects was around $4 to $5 billion a year. If we now want to increase that to $20 billion a year, just in the public sector, there's a whole different approach needed. Institutional capacity, project management skills, procurement approaches, approval processes, ability to deal with environmental and social assessments and implementation. And I think CSO monitoring and third-party evaluations by those outside the public sector will also be very, very important. This is a huge lift. It's very tedious to build, but it will be needed. So I think this is one thing that I take away from the visits these last few days that we need to focus more on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Roman. Thank you, Tymofiy. As a moderator, you've noticed that I've been quiet about saying much, but now I'm going to perhaps misuse my privilege just for a couple of minutes, because for me, these are my last few weeks working on Ukraine. So it's an emotional time, as some of you know, for me. But I have said this several times, and I want to say this again. I am, as each one of you, incredibly troubled and concerned about the present, but I'm incredibly optimistic about Ukraine's future. And that really is part of this conversation, right? How to build that future. And I want to make 3 points, which is very much a summary of things that we've talked about. That future first is going to be built by you, and by you I'm expressly talking about the students in the audience. You are going to build this future because you're going to demand this future. You need to make this future happen. This goes back, Tymofiy, to my second point, which echoes what you said. Every reform, every change that has happened, every positive change has not been because of supply. You're economists, right? It's not been because of supply, it's been because of demand. And Ukraine has this incredible asset of a civil society that, contrary to most countries in this region, is alive, well, has path corrected, as Tymofiy, you said, every time the country has been off course. It is time to demand the changes that is needed for this future. And that demand will then be translated by local authorities, by the international partners overall, if that demand is concentrated, clear-minded, and expressed. And that, I think, is important. So again, most of your economic students, be economists, think of demand and supply. Supply won't get it there. It won't be the authorities who will just make sure, or the international partners who will make sure that things will happen. It needs to be demanded, it needs to be asked for, and it needs to be clear. So that's, I think, one channeling of this. A second point is really thinking a bit about how this demand takes place. And Tymofiy, we were partners in the land reform process, and I'm very proud of what you started and we were able to achieve together. But reforms, it's a very weird term, right? Reforms. World Bank talks about reforms all the time. What is this reform? Reform is positive change. And positive change has to work. So the other thing that we need to understand, and I know that people in the room believe, but this is what you have to talk about, is that it's not sufficient to accept the status quo, right? Because there's always, and I've been working on Ukraine for now 3 years, and sometimes I meet people saying, that's the way life is. This is the polity. This is the way Ukraine operates. And it's so difficult to change this. But that is not true, because Ukraine has had revolutions that showed that it wasn't true. So ask for reform, ask for positive change, not for compromises. Now, I'm not naive, right? Compromises will happen. The path to reform is slow. The land reform that we are proud of is not the land reform you originally thought about. It's going to get there, but it's not the land reform you imagined. So it's going to go slowly. It's going to go in fits and starts, but reform is something that you need. Be a voice for judicial reform. Without judicial reform, this country is not going to have the future that we all want for it. So it is important to think about reforms. The World Bank will be a partner in this. The World Bank will support reformers, but that needs that groundswell of demand, if you'd like. Lastly, and I will indulge my biases, I'm an economist. Many of you are economists or training to be economists. Do that. Economics is the dismal science, but it's not about the theory. It's about the discipline that you have to put in your thinking. So exercise the discipline. Tymofiy, thank you for what you have helped build in this institution, but also in the country. The discipline of thinking, the discipline of argument, and a way to go forward. With that, thank you all for being here. Tymofiy, I hand over to you.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to close this, and we humans try to think in simplified terms. The world is complex and continuous. We organize it in some simple categories: humans, organizations, reports. So I'm going to organize, and I'm going to remind all of us that it takes everyone for a report like that to happen. It takes everyone for this institution to exist. So I want to thank the World Bank as an institution. I also would like to thank the Kyiv School of Economics as an institution, but I also want to thank a bunch of unnamed so far donors who supported the data that we have produced. And some of the data we used ourselves, and we issued yesterday or today a separate assessment reform. The number is actually almost the same. Your number, I think, is 135. Our number is 143.8. That's exactly what Joanna said about multi-dimensional approach that gives room for robustness and debate. And it was sponsored by you, I have to say that, and I'm very proud that it takes humanity to win the war. It takes humanity to build a country. So it's USAID, SEP, USAID ERA, UNDP, and USAID TAPAS. So, like with you, many agencies were involved, so many agencies are involved with us. We're very proud that we have been able to provide you, for your report, some data which government was unwilling to provide. That's another role of the civil society or intermediaries, where we can stabilize some political issues. And the government can work with us, and we can work with you, and you can work directly with the government. But I also want to thank all our 35 analysts, and I am not able to name everyone, but at least We have Vlada here. We have Andrei Bespyatov, somewhere from Dragon. We want to thank Dragon analysts. Dmitro Gorunyov from CES, and of course Kyiv Vyshlinsky here, and Igor Pidubny for Agro and Energy from KSE. So we actually have 17 organizations working with us, 17 on the damage assessment. So it takes everyone together to build the country. And I will finish by thanking you all, but also thanking people who are dying today so that we can have this conversation right now. Thank you so much for your sacrifice, and we will work tirelessly to make sure that your dream of Ukraine comes to reality. Thank you.